Okay, this is Chapter 6 of the American Government course. We're going to be talking specifically about the President's office, and then we'll be getting into the executive branch and the bureaucratic function of the executive branch a little bit later. In this section, some of what we talk about will be a review of what we talked about in the Constitution, but I also want to expand on this a little bit and talk about how the president's own powers have expanded over the years and why. So how does the president get elected? We've talked about the Electoral College a little bit in the Constitution. The framers were concerned about a pure democracy or having a president that was elected directly by the people that could be somewhat of a demagogue if he was so inclined and could inspire populist support and then amass power and take over the other two branches. So they wanted to filter that through a system of electoral votes where each state is assigned a certain number of electors, and then these electors are delegated to go and cast their votes for the president. So currently we have a total of 538 electoral votes. It takes a majority to win the presidency, 270 electoral votes out of the 538 total. That number comes from the total 435 members of the House of Representatives, plus the 100 senators, plus 3 votes that were given to District of Columbia in a constitutional amendment. And so therefore each state has the same number of electoral votes as they do representatives plus 2 senators. For example, New Jersey has 12 congressional districts, therefore they have 12 representatives plus 2 senators. So New Jersey has 14 electoral votes. Almost all the states have adopted what they call this winner-take-all system, to where whichever candidate that has the most of the state's popular vote by plurality therefore gets all of that state's electoral votes. States figured out fairly early on that they would have more power doing it this way, because if a president wanted to get all of the electoral votes, he would have to pay attention to them and perhaps campaign or make promises for that state, and then that state would hand him all of its electoral votes. Otherwise, it would still just be almost a proportional representation of the popular vote. Now, the Electoral College is confusing and controversial. If we have another election to where the candidate that wins the popular vote, but however does not win the electoral vote, we might even see some movement on that, on a constitutional amendment to revise that. Now let's look at some of the numbers here. For example, we're talking about New Jersey, 14 electoral votes. And the biggest states, of course, California, most populated state, has 55 electoral votes. That means that California has 53 representatives plus 2 senators. Texas has 38 electoral votes. New York and Florida both have 29 electoral votes. Illinois, Pennsylvania, which are potentially swing states usually, have a significant amount of 20 electoral votes there as well. In the 2016 election, this is how the electoral vote broke down. The red states are the states where all of those electoral votes were given to the Republican candidate Donald Trump, because that state had the popular vote winner was the Republican candidate. Blue state had the Democratic candidate, the popular vote winner, Hillary Clinton. Maine intends to be a little bit different there, and they split up their electoral votes by this little process right here. And it turned out that Hillary Clinton got 3, Donald Trump got 1. Even though most of the states do have this winner-take-all obligation, in some cases it's official in that state that that's what will happen, but there were a few other defections in the 2016 election. So that might be something the states would need to address, because it could, if it's a close election, then it could affect the final outcome if the state is intending for all of their electoral votes to go to that candidate, but yet one or a few of the electors decides to go against that. Now let's just review briefly here the expressed powers of the president. These are the ones that are expressed in the Constitution, and we've touched on these already. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so that we will have civilian control of the military. Talked about how it was useful for the president to have some flexibility and the ability to respond quickly to potential threats. We also know, according to the Constitution, he cannot declare war. Congress has the power to declare war. Now, Congress has not declared war since World War II, but we've been in several wars since then, so we're going to have to talk about how that happens. And that will be part of the expanded powers of the president that we'll get into here in a little bit. As far as more express powers of the president, we've already talked about how the president has the appointment power. He appoints all the Supreme Court justices and federal judges as soon as any vacancies come about. He also has the power to grant pardons and reprieves. That has kind of gotten presidents in trouble a few times, where they've pardoned somebody where there were some questions as to why they may have pardoned them. One of the most famous, of course, being Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. Most historians seem to agree that in the hindsight, that was probably the best thing to do, because it kind of ended all of that to where there was not going to be the circus of a trial. Try to get beyond that. Nixon, of course, resigned in humiliation and never really recovered from that. There have been other pardons that people might question, but that's another power the framers decided to give. If that gets abused, who knows? Could see some action on that as far as potentially revising that. The diplomatic power of the president, he appoints the foreign ambassadors. He also receives foreign ambassadors. We already talked about how the president is the face of the nation. He represents the United States of America. He's the only person that's elected by the entire country. And he also has the power to negotiate treaties. So his representatives go work out the details. The president, of course, will sign that agreement. However, the Senate has the power to finally approve any treaty by a 2/3 vote. And we'll talk about how that's changed quite a bit, because it's getting increasingly more difficult for the U.S. government to approve international treaties. So the presidents have, over the past several decades, increasingly gone to a different route. So we'll get into that here in a minute. President also appoints all the officials of the executive branch, all the department heads, cabinet secretaries, undersecretaries. He also has the power to fill vacancies during a recess. There have been some controversial times where the president has nominated somebody that the Senate is not very happy with, and they send out signals that they might not approve that person, and the president may put them in that vacancy during a recess, and that could create some controversy later on as far as the validity of that person's appointment. Now, also, one of the most important powers of the president is to execute the laws. He's the chief executive over the executive branch, and once the laws are put together by Congress, the president signs those, but then even more importantly, they are taken into society by the executive branch that has the power to pass rules and regulations to implement that law and enforce that law. Legislatively, the president sets the agenda through the State of the Union. So since he's the person that's elected by the entire United States and is considerably more publicity involved in his election. He can say that he was elected with the mandate to accomplish this or that. So therefore, he kind of sets the tone, sets the agenda for what policies are going to be pursued. And he can also convene or adjourn Congress if he feels like that there's an emergency that needs to be addressed. And of course, we've already talked about the veto power. He has the power to not sign that bill if he does not agree with it. Again, these don't happen very often. And we also know that the Congress could override the president's veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, which of course is also very difficult and very rare as well. Now, looking at past vetoes, this is also shown as somewhat of a bar chart on pages 168 and 169. As you can see, as we get further and further into the current era, fewer and fewer vetoes. Had quite a few during Roosevelt and Truman administration. As we get in the last couple of decades, considerably fewer vetoes because there's actually been less productivity of Congress. So that kind of makes logical sense there. If your Congress is passing fewer and fewer and fewer bills, where you're going to have fewer and fewer opportunities for vetoes, as well as fewer and fewer overriding vetoes as well. Now, the president's powers do also get a lot of spark a lot of political cartooning. We know that one of Obama's agendas was to reform health care, and Obamacare had quite a bit of opposition from the Republican Party, as you can see from this cartoon right here. And we also know that there was some cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court that were looking at to try to dismantle the Obamacare program. And one particular case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice upheld the individual mandate, which was what the controversy was, as well that was brought to the court. Even though that was upheld, we see that with the new president under Donald Trump, the more recent tax bill actually ended the individual mandate. So still a lot of push and pull, give and take on our health care legislation. Now let's talk about some powers of the president that are somewhat inherent. These are not so much expanded powers as they are powers that are interpreted over time that the president is logically going to need to do. And this was first articulated, I guess you could say, in a Supreme Court case in the late 1800s, where just the general rights and the duties and the obligations of the presidency are going to give him certain powers, things that he needs to do in his job as president, kind of in conjunction with this commander-in-chief situation where he may need to call out forces to help in something, or National Guard. Well, there's going to be some unspecified needs that where he might have to act in times of conflict, emergencies, disasters, that sort of thing. Also, this concept of prosecutorial discretion simply means that since the president is in charge of the executive branch, which then executes and interprets the laws, well, he can actually instruct one of his branches to either do something or not do something that might affect policy. One of the best recent examples, I could say, would be the Dreamers Act. Under prosecutorial discretion, the President Obama had instructed the Department of Homeland Security not to go after children who had been brought over here by not their own will, but they were brought over here by their parents. So that was called the Dreamers Act, but technically what it was the president saying that the Department of Homeland Security and immigration officials are not going to go after these particular individuals and then give them the opportunity to come forward and apply for the program. Because of the fact he's also the only person that's elected by all of the people, that gives him powers just because of the fact that he's got jurisdiction over the entire country. Now, there are some other things that have occurred over the centuries there, Andrew Jackson really kind of expanded the power of the presidency because of his populist appeal and his powers of organization. We already talked about how he was responsible for organizing the Democratic Party when he was denied the presidency back in the 1820s. He also made full use of what is called the spoil system, where he really passed out a lot of favors to people that would support him or help him get elected or help take his power on down through the system. So it was a patronage type system with rewarding favors with jobs and things like that. So Jackson built up some precedents there of presidential power. But during the wartime periods is when the presidents have really expanded power. But in these cases, they were temporary. We talked about already how President Lincoln, in order to try to win the Civil War, he did pretty much anything he could possibly do. He suspended habeas corpus, arrested without warrants. He banned treasonable correspondence. He even censored newspapers. He seized property and even proclaimed martial law during his administration there during the Civil War, and also got a lot of legislation passed when the southern states were not there. So therefore, when the war was ended and the southern states were brought back in, they had legislation already passed. Woodrow Wilson, quite a bit of powers delegated to him in the war effort to win the war. Franklin Roosevelt also had been elected on the New Deal policies to try to alleviate the Depression, which gave federal government in general a little bit more intervention into our economy. During World War II, President Roosevelt really went to extraordinary measures to try to win the war, of course. He had created several wartime agencies, which then mobilized industrial facilities and labor to meet certain production goals, particularly for the war. He rationed staple goods. He prohibited some driving of automobiles. He cut production of consumer durable goods. He imposed wage and price controls and pushed major tax increases. This was all to meet the necessities of war. Also, this included the internment of Japanese Americans during this period as well. So, major powers during wartime, but for the most part, these powers receded. So what we want to talk about here that is relevant in today's world is the expanding powers that the president has been given, particularly over the past several decades. Now, one of these is what we'll call here as a blanket resolution authorizing force, in some cases called the authorization to use military force. There's been several episodes since World War II where Congress has given President authorization, basically a blank check, to take care of this problem. And the wording is such that it says by any means necessary, or in the case of the 2001 War on Terror resolution, authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force. And so what presidents have done, which may not have been the original intent, but they will do whatever they can do to take care of this problem. Because if they don't take care of this problem satisfactorily, they run the risk of not getting reelected. So then it becomes to where this situation gets ramped up in order to try to, quote unquote, win it, which is very difficult to do in today's world of terrorist type conflicts. Then it grows to where it becomes a full-scale war and does not typically turn out very well. We'll look at some examples. The Korean War was where Truman literally took it to the United Nations, but it was still a resolution type option rather than declaring war. And that, of course, expanded to a 3-year conflict where nothing much was accomplished. Vietnam War, even a more drastic example, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was given to President Johnson in 1964, right after it was suspected that a couple of torpedoes had been fired upon one of our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson was running for re-election in 1964. Human beings in general like presidents who are a little bit more aggressive in taking care of problems. Plus, Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater, who was an extremely strong war hawk, even suggested dropping an atomic bomb on Vietnam. So that's what Johnson was running against. So he said, give me this authorization to take care of this problem. And as you can see, these things could be tremendously popular at the time. You can see how easily it passed in both houses, and yet very quickly this started to escalate into full-scale war, and by 1968 it had gotten so large scale as far as we had 500,000 troops there. The cost was enormous. Public opinion was turning against it, so much so that President Johnson decided not to run for re-election in 1968. The Gulf War resolution, interestingly enough, did not have quite as much support as far as taking care of this problem, in this case where Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. Fairly serious violation to invade another country. That was one of the few cases where it did turn out fairly well, where this situation was handled relatively quickly with very few casualties on the U.S. side, which is, however ironic, though, 10 years later, we decided to try to finish the job in Iraq. That turned out much worse. Before we got to that, though, was the War on Terror resolution. Very quickly, within a couple of weeks after 9/11, as you can see, this patriotic rally around the flag effect was again in effect here, where overwhelming support to pass that to invade Afghanistan, to topple the Taliban and go after al-Qaeda. Even though the Osama bin Laden was eventually killed, Afghanistan does have a government that is somewhat allied with the United States. Afghanistan is still an incredibly poor, weak, unstable country, and if we pulled out today, it's quite possible the Taliban could just move right back in and take over 20 years later. That's one of the sad realities of our world, that we could spend almost 20 years there and then eventually say, okay, it's time to pack up and move out, and then the Taliban comes right back in to where we started from 20 years ago. On the heels of that, there was quite a bit of motivation under the Bush administration to go back in there and get rid of Saddam Hussein. Fairly strong support, 70%. We can talk about this a little bit more later on, because within 3 years that had flip-flopped, because that did not go very well. More people were getting killed than what was anticipated. We got involved in a sectarian civil war there in Iraq. Started to cost a couple of $1 trillion when it was all said and done. Yes, even though Iraq did create a new government that was democratically elected, it is still a long way from a democracy, and in fact they have kind of turned away from us somewhat and allied a little bit more with Iran, again, more along sectarian lines there. A lot of debate and controversy over the results of these wars, but the point being here is that the president was given authorization to take care of a problem, and it escalated into war. That's the point we're trying to make. And at the end of the Vietnam War, a war powers resolution was passed in order to try to get a handle on this because of the fiasco of the Vietnam War. But the War Powers Resolution has never been very effective. We know that the president can send lots of people over there before he even consults with Congress. Doesn't necessarily have to call them troops, or even could mobilize troops in a neighboring territory and not have to really consult with Congress in order to try to prepare for that. This clause right here is really not very, well, it's not very practical, because if you spend 2 months mobilizing to prepare for something, and you've got 500,000 troops and all kinds of equipment, airfields, aircraft carriers, tanks, half tracks, and then for Congress to say, oh, sorry, now you got to bring all that back, would not be very practical. And then this one right here, where Congress wanted to maintain their ability to withdraw the troops if they felt like that this was not going well, within a few years, this was struck down by the Supreme Court. This is referred to as a legislative veto, which means that the Congress cannot violate that separation of powers. Once Congress passes the law, or in this case declares war, then they have to pass it off to the president, who's commander-in-chief, who is tasked by the Constitution to conduct that war. So therefore, Congress cannot violate that separation of powers and say, we're going to bring the troops back. So therefore, that Supreme Court ruling there put any power out of this war powers resolution. Nixon, of course, vetoed that in order to maintain his ability, or a president's ability, to conduct this as he saw fit. But the Congress did override Nixon's veto. But as I said, this war powers resolution has been virtually ineffective since. Obama, you could say, was tasked with keeping us out of war, but yes, still keeping an eye on terrorists. So the surveillance programs had to pick up because the Obama administration had been elected to get us out of the ground wars. So we had to pick up on drone activity and surveillance programs in order to still keep an eye on terrorist activity. Another expanded power of the president is what we call executive agreements. And these have virtually taken the place of the Senate-approved international treaties. Those are very, very difficult to get in today's climate. It's hard to find 2/3 of the Senate that would agree on anything. So most treaties today are fairly routine, minor stuff, such as extradition treaties, which the Senate would not have any reason not to approve that. But any large global treaties that have to do with things like global warming or criminal pursuits, such as like the International Criminal Court, those things are very difficult to get 2/3 of the Senate to approve on. And we may be kind of pulling back a little bit to more of a nationalist sentiment as well, where the current administration is clearly pulling back from existing treaties. So the executive agreement allows the president to make an international compact with a country or a handful of countries. And this agreement has the same force of treaty without having to have Senate approval. So it's giving the president flexibility to make agreements with a few states. Of course, it also eliminates that potential of never-ending approval process to where the Senate may never be able to get around to approving something. So it gives the president also a little bit more credibility to make these agreements with other countries without being undermined by the Senate. And this goes all the way back to the League of Nations treaty that Woodrow Wilson, actually, it was his general idea and motivation to do this, and he went to Europe and ironed out the League of Nations treaty and then came back, and his own Senate did not approve it. Lost a lot of credibility with Europe there after negotiating that, and then the Senate did not approve it. So these executive agreements, though, have been upheld by the Supreme Court going all the way back to the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was making agreements in order to try to get us a little bit more prepared in case we had to get involved in World War II. Roosevelt was very much in contact with Winston Churchill. It would have been disastrous if England fell to Hitler. And so keeping close tabs on that, we were not really prepared for it. We were still pretty much isolationist at that time. And a couple of them did get disputed, taken all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the president, saying the president has to be able to make to have the credibility and the flexibility to make these agreements to do his job as, whether it's commander-in-chief or as the face of foreign policy. The Destroys for Bases Agreement was a big one in 1940. This has really become the norm over the past several decades. Most international agreements are these executive agreements instead of treaties. And in fact, we're seeing that Senate-approved international treaties are becoming more rare. Even as I said before, our current administration is kind of pulling back from pursuing international treaties, particularly anything that would have to be approved by the Senate. Now, the third type of expanded power I want to talk about is called the executive order. These have expanded over time, particularly as the executive branch has gotten bigger and it is tasked more things to do. But basically, an executive order is simply the president making a rule that his branch must follow. As long as it does not interfere with a congressional law, it has formal status of legislation. So most of these things have to do with changes procedures or revising organization, changing the structure of the executive branch, having to do with personnel. But as I said, it also can affect policy. I already talked about how an Obama executive order applied for the Dreamers Act. Lots of executive orders have to do with sanctions. Since the president is in charge of foreign policy and all the foreign agencies, he can put a sanction on another country through an executive order. And these can be very powerful things that a president can do that he does not have to go through congressional approval. These have expanded as well, particularly when we see that Congress has been increasingly non-productive. We've talked about that in the last chapter. We saw the increasing non-productivity of Congress. Well, that's then kind of deferred more power onto the president to make more of these executive orders in order to get something done, whether it's even incremental, something that the president feels like that he has got the jurisdiction to do in lieu of congressional inactivity. Now, when we look at the number of executive orders that have been enacted over the past few decades, Harry Truman was quite prolific. He was doing a lot of restructuring in the aftermath of World War II, kind of preparing for the Cold War that was brewing between us and the Soviet Union. So you can see some of the comparisons there of past presidents who were in office for 8 years. Donald Trump did start off quite actively, signed 42 executive orders in his first 200 days, which would have put him on this level right here, but he has slowed down somewhat since then. But we will continue to see that the executive orders will be a common and perhaps increasing use of presidential power, particularly if Congress is not becoming more active in passing legislation as was originally intended. Now, some other expansions that have been claimed. Executive privilege, which the current administration has claimed several times in refusing to submit information to House committees that are investigating this or that. But executive privilege has been around for a while, where the president feels like he needs to run his business without being scrutinized or without transparency. However, when it goes to a court, oftentimes it could end up to where they're going to rule against the president. One of the more famous cases was when Richard Nixon declined to turn over the rest of his tapes. It went right to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled against President Nixon because there was an active investigation into the Watergate scandal, and he had to comply. And it turned out that Nixon resigned within just a few weeks after that ruling. We also see that as the executive branch gets bigger, as far as the federal executive branch, as far as manpower goes, it's stabilized over the past half century as far as manpower. Still, as far as the expense and what government is tasked to do, that keeps expanding because our population is getting bigger. the complexity of our society is getting bigger. The market can't handle all of what we need or solve all of our problems. So we rely on government to do things for us. And so that increases the delegation that the president is going to have to execute laws. That means the bureaucracy, which we're going to be talking about here pretty soon, the bureaucracy and what it's tasked to do as far as making rules and regulations. So that requires more delegation from the president to his expanding bureaucracy. So that's an element of expanding power. We also know that the Congress cannot pass a bill that's 100,000 pages long that provides every detail known under the sun. No, bills are trying to get the basics out there, and then the more vague that bill is, the more interpretation that is required by the executive branch in order to implement that law into society or to enforce that law to make sure that people are complying with it. So we'll talk about that rulemaking process within the next two lectures here, but this is just another aspect of expanding power of the president. The attention that's put on the election of this one person is becoming overwhelming. Quite a bit of scrutiny and publicity and press on who's running for president. We put a lot of symbolic power on this chief executive, which cannot possibly be realized. The amount of media coverage that the president gets just to get elected, and then while they're in office, as far as what we perceive the president should be doing for us, which is overwhelming what we expect of this one human being, when really it's Congress that's tasked with actually making the law. So this is what has been very fascinating over the few decades that where this seems to have been increasing. But it's always been an issue where the president has to make lots of promises in order to get elected or reelected, but yet a lot of this is unrealistic expectations, and this is one of the reasons why virtually every president declines in approval ratings over the course of his office. Because, first of all, you have a lot of people that don't vote, so there's a lot of people who can say, I don't have any ownership to this particular president because I didn't vote for him. But because of the promises that will not be fulfilled and because of all these unrealistic expectations, there was a consistent trend where you can see this is actually a chart in the book. As you can see, with the exceptions of Reagan and Clinton, every president has declined in their popularity or their approval ratings. Now, Reagan and Clinton both actually started a little bit lower than what most other presidents started at, because you can see there's a lot of expectations with most presidents, and then they start to decline fairly quickly and consistently over their course of their term. For example, George W. Bush, again, we had that rally around the flag effect there after 9/11, but then approval ratings started to decline pretty dramatically as the wars did not go quite so well, declined even more when the recession hit. Looking at the expansion of this, we can see that even the Obama administration, they had started fairly high. Also a general decline, even though it spiked back upwards. Overall, general decline as to what they started with. Trump started the lowest of all modern-day presidents as far as approval ratings. Could potentially see an increase with Donald Trump, but we also see that the trend is, as expected, generally lowering over the course of his presidency. All right, so what we'll do next is talk in Chapter 7 about the executive branch, which the president is over, but the executive branch is large and got lots of agencies and departments and that sort of thing. So we want to talk separately about the executive branch and then about its bureaucratic function.